On the 7th of August, the convention had resolved a number of important issues, and then one thing they were discussing was who should vote. And Gouverneur Morris, a delegate from Pennsylvania, suggested restricting the privilege of voting to freeholders, that is, people who owned property outright. John Dickinson, also representing, actually he was representing Delaware, one of the most important political thinkers of the time, thought that this would be a good idea. Freeholders, he said, would be the best guardians of liberty, and protecting the country against the dangerous influence of those multitudes without property and without principle, with which our country, like all others, will one day abound, would be an important thing. The mass of the people in 1787 already were freeholders. They wouldn't lose anything by this, so they wouldn't object. So this would be the appropriate time to restrict the right to vote to freeholders. Well, Nathaniel Gorham, a merchant from Boston, objected to this, and he said, look, in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, merchants and mechanics who don't own land vote, and our elections there are just as good as in places where freeholders vote. And as for the future, Gorham said, it's not to be supposed that the government will last so long to produce this effect. Can it be supposed that this vast country, including the Western Territory, will 150 years hence remain one nation? Interesting question. Gouverneur Morris said he wasn't afraid of people calling names. People would charge that limiting the right to vote to freeholders was going to establish an aristocracy. Well, Morris wasn't afraid of name calling, and he said if there's going to be an aristocracy, it will grow out of the House of Representatives, because people get elected to the House in order to augment their wealth, in order to become aristocrats. The time is not distant, he said, when this country will abound with mechanics and manufacturers who will receive their bread from their employers. Will such men be the secure and faithful guardians of liberty? Will they be an impregnable barrier against aristocracy? No, they'll give away their votes. They'll sell their votes. Remember, most voting was done publicly in this day. So if you work for someone and you go to the town meeting and stand up to vote, and you vote the other way than the guy who pays you does, well, you're not going to vote against the interest of someone who is paying you. They'll give away their votes, and merchants and others, Morris said, if they value the right to vote, they can acquire property. That is, if they have wealth and they want to vote, they can buy property. If they don't value the right to vote, then they don't deserve it. Interesting. And the convention, well, remember, all of these guys own property. They're not going to lose anything by this, but they're thinking about the future and what is going to happen when the landless folks start controlling things. And seems like a snowball in effect here at the convention, and then from a rather unlikely place, opposition emerges. George Mason, probably the wealthiest man in the room, owns about 200 slaves, owns a huge estate in Virginia, says, well, wait a minute. Every man who has evidence of attachment to and a permanent common interest with society should share all of its rights and privileges. Why are we talking about merchants and mechanics as being somehow dangerous? And he said, should the merchant, should the moneyed man, should they be considered dangerous characters? But then he goes further. Should the merchant, the moneyed man, the parent of a large number of children whose fortunes are to be pursued in his own country, should they be viewed as suspicious characters and unworthy to be trusted with the common rights of their fellow citizens? So interesting. Merchants, moneyed men, and parents of families. I mean, these children are going to grow up and pursue their interests in this country, and that, to Mason, is evidence of a permanent common attachment to society. Madison was a little skeptical. He said, freeholders would be the safest repositories of liberty. In the future, he said, a majority might have no property, and then they're either going to combine together against those who do have property, or more likely, he said, they will become the tools of opulence and ambition. That is, they will be bribed by those who do have property to support their interest. So this seems like an idea that the delegates are captivated with. And then Benjamin Franklin speaks up. Now, throughout the convention, Franklin sat in the front, and when he did have something to say, he would write out an elegant speech, which he then would have someone else read for him. This is one of the few instances where Franklin doesn't write out his speech. He speaks directly. And this isn't Franklin, the sage, the learned man, the representative American. This is Franklin, the son of the Boston soap boiler, who ran away from home when he was 16 and pursued his fortune by his own wits and made himself the greatest man of the century. Don't insult the virtue and common sense of ordinary people. That's how he began. So Franklin talked about the American sailors who were imprisoned during the Revolution on British prison ships. They could have become free by joining the British service, but they wouldn't. However, British sailors taken prisoner by Americans did join the American Navy. And why is this? Because in the two countries, common people are treated differently. Sailors are the lowest rung of the economic ladder in the 18th century. In fact, Dr. Johnson said, the only men who go to sea are those who cannot contrive to get themselves into prison. But here Franklin is using sailors as the people whom we don't want to distrust. And he said it in England. They thought tumultuous meetings were dangerous, so they restricted the right to vote to freeholders to prevent the landless mobs from assembling and protesting. So they say, okay, you can't vote anymore. And then the following year, they placed burdens of labor and additional burdens on those who couldn't vote. So you start by trying to restrict the right to vote, and you end by restricting the non-voters. And Franklin also said that the elected should not be in a position to judge the electors. So don't insult the virtue and common sense of ordinary people. And the fact that in this country, someone can make his or her own way is an important thing. This is what distinguishes the country we are creating from those we have seen around the world. So the convention does not restrict the right to vote to freeholders, and we should thank Franklin and George Mason, and of course the virtue and common sense of ordinary people for allowing this to happen. Thank you.